Hello everyone. Imagine you are standing at a busy crosswalk. The light turns green and you step forward. You feel absolute, undeniable ownership over that mundane decision. You commanded your leg muscles to move and they seamlessly obeyed. But consider this highly specific thought experiment. What if the precise neural firing that initiated your step was actually the mathematically inevitable combination of cellular environments, hormonal tides, and the evolutionary pressures established long before you were even born? Today, we will dissect Robert Sapolsky's core thesis in Determined. The visual before you presents the architecture of intent, fundamentally challenging the way we perceive human agency. The text clearly states that a science of life without free will requires us to abandon the concept of a ghost in the machine. That phrase, originally coined by philosopher Gilbert Ryle, describes the dualistic illusion that an immaterial conscious self sits inside our physical brain, pulling the levers of behavior. Sapolsky argues that this ghost is entirely absent. Instead, what we perceive as intent is merely the inescapable output of a deterministic biological and environmental continuum. Look closely at Figure 1, illustrating the biological substrate of intent. We see the synaptic cleft, the microscopic gap between neurons where neurotransmitters shuttle across. This is not a void where free will magically intervenes. It is a rigid mechanical junction. Every single molecule acting in this space does so because it was compelled by a prior physical state. There is no uncaused cause. Our conscious intention is not the prime mover of our actions. It is simply the final domino falling in an unfathomably complex sequence. We are forced to confront the reality that our deepest desires, our moral choices, and our everyday actions are physically manufactured by a biological continuum. We must follow the continuum backward in time, tracing the exact sequence of physical events that lead to any given action. Now, consider the ancient mythological cosmology claiming that the Earth rests flat on the back of a giant turtle. When William James asked the old woman what that turtle rests upon, she replied that it is turtles all the way down. The William James mechanism illustrated here appropriates that exact metaphor to explain human causality. Just as the myth claims the world rests on an infinite stack, human behavior rests on an unbroken chain of prior biological and environmental causes. There is no floating turtle. There is no behavior suspended in the vacuum of free will, independent of physical history. To understand a single human action, we must trace this unbroken chain from milliseconds to millennia. Look at the timeline presented across this slide. We begin at the moment of action and intent, exploring the immediate neurobiology that occurs milliseconds before a choice. Then we regress to the minutes and hours prior, where sensory input and endocrine releases, like adrenaline, alter the neurochemical landscape of the brain. Moving further back to the scale of years, we encounter brain maturation, specifically the structural development of the prefrontal cortex and the neural pruning. Decades prior, childhood epigenetics show us how early life environments physically alter gene expression through DNA methylation and histone modification. Finally, we reach back millennia, examining the genetic and cultural evolution that selected for ancestral traits. Each of these stages is a turtle resting squarely upon the one beneath it. You cannot isolate the immediate decision making observed in the present moment from the species, history, and the cumulative culture that engineered the brain making that decision. If you attempt to explain a behavior by only looking at the neurons firing in the current second, you are entirely ignoring the structural brain development that laid those neural pathways, the hormones that lowered their activation thresholds, and the evolutionary pressures that designed the hormones themselves. Everything is physically tethered to the past. The stack is infinite, and it is entirely deterministic. But here is the catch when we analyze the immediate present. We harbor a deeply ingrained illusion about the timeline of our own consciousness. Examine the timeline of the Libet illusion on the screen. In the experiments conducted by Benjamin Libet, researchers discovered that your brain commits to an action hundreds of milliseconds before you consciously decide to take it. Let us trace the exact nodes of this mechanism. At node 1, negative 500 milliseconds before an action, the readiness potential begins. This is a measurable electrical shift, specifically the activation of the supplementary motor area and the pre-supplementary motor area of the brain. The physical machinery of movement is already engaging, yet it is not until node 2, a full 300 milliseconds later, at negative 200 milliseconds, that you experience the conscious awareness of the choice. Finally, at node 30 milliseconds, the muscle movement executes. This sequence fundamentally destabilizes our perception of agency. The conscious awareness of a decision arrives after the neurological commitment has already been made. Therefore, conscious intent is a post-hoc illusion, not the prime mover. It is the brain's way of updating the conscious self on what the physical machinery has already initiated. As the slide explicitly states, focusing only on the final 3 seconds of a decision is microscopic myopia. It is akin to analyzing the final few feet of a marathon and declaring that the runner simply materialized at the finish line. When we judge human actions, particularly in a legal or moral context, we are almost exclusively obsessing over these final milliseconds. We ask if the individual intended to act in that exact moment. But if the intent itself is merely a delayed echo of a readiness potential that was triggered by even older physical states, then intent is stripped of its moral weight. The brain dictates the choice, and the conscious mind merely claims the credit after the fact, trapped in a seamless neurological illusion. Let us step back from the millisecond scale and examine the minutes and hours preceding an action. We like to believe that our profound moral judgments are the product of rigorous, rational deliberation. The reality is the tyranny of sensory input. Our highest cognitive functions are routinely hijacked by blood sugar levels, visceral feelings, and subconscious cues. Consider the graph displaying favorable parole rulings by judges over the course of a day. This is a surgical thought experiment drawn from real data. We see peaks at 65% immediately following breakfast and lunch. The judges are well fed, their blood glucose levels are stable, and their brains have the metabolic resources required to execute complex, empathetic reasoning. They grant parole, but trace the line downward. As the time of day progresses toward the next meal, the favorable rulings plummet, hitting troughs near 0%. This stark decline correlates directly with depleted blood glucose and cognitive fatigue. Hungry judges grant almost no parole. A judge sitting on the bench might genuinely believe they are evaluating a prisoner's remorse or rehabilitation potential through a pure, objective legal lens. They will write lengthy judicial opinions, justifying their harshness based on precedent and law. Yet, the data demonstrates that justice is dictated by the gastrointestinal tract, not a rational soul. When the brain lacks glucose, it defaults to the path of least resistance, which in the context of parole means maintaining the status quo and keeping the prisoner locked up. The moral output is entirely subordinate to the metabolic input. If a judge's perception of right and wrong can be so drastically altered by whether or not they have had an afternoon snack, it becomes impossible to argue for an isolated, free-floating rational mind. Every judgment, every expression of supposed free will, is physically anchored to the immediate sensory and physiological environment of the organism making the choice. Moving further backward to the scale of hours and days, we must confront the endocrine tides. The core mechanism to understand here is that hormones do not invent behavior out of nowhere. Instead, they actively lower the threshold for pre-existing neural tendencies to fire. They are chemical modulators that tilt the neurological playing field. Look at the 3 primary examples detailed on the slide. First, testosterone. It decreases threat detection thresholds and empathy, while promoting egocentric logic. If a modern executive is flooded with testosterone, they do not suddenly invent a new aggressive business strategy. Rather, their brain simply requires less provocation to execute the aggressive tendencies they already possess. Second, consider oxytocin. It is widely celebrated as the bonding hormone, and indeed, it increases in-group trust. But there is a dark side to this molecule. It actively drives preemptive aggression and xenophobia. toward outgroups. It makes you love your neighbor, but it physically primes your brain to suspect and attack the stranger. Finally, we have glucocorticoids, the primary stress hormones. Chronic stress disrupts frontal cortex connectivity. This disruption strips away our capacity for nuanced, long-term thinking, forcing reliance on rapid, habitual, and fearful amygdala responses. Imagine an individual navigating a high-stress financial crisis. Their glucocorticoid levels soar, essentially disconnecting the rational braking system of their frontal lobe, leaving them at the mercy of their most primal, fear-based reflexes. In all three cases, the behavioral output is dictated by the chemical saturation of the brain. You might think you are choosing to be ruthless in a negotiation, or choosing to passionately defend your community, or choosing to lash out in fear. But those choices were already heavily weighted by the endocrine tides washing over your neural circuits hours and days before the event occurred. Your decisions are the symptoms of your hormonal state, leaving no room for a sovereign conscious agent. Now we look back to the scale of years, specifically targeting the slow baking frontal cortex. This region is the brain's center of executive function and morality, responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and ethical reasoning. But the critical mechanical reality is that this region is not fully encoded by genetics. It is constructed by the environment of adolescence. Let us trace the developmental sequence shown here. During childhood, the brain undergoes synaptic overproduction, creating a massive, disorganized web of connections. Then comes adolescence, which acts as the neurological bottleneck. This is the pruning phase. The brain aggressively eliminates unused synapses to increase efficiency. However, during this phase, the frontal cortex is an immature braking system that is routinely overwhelmed by hormonal surges. This perfectly explains the impulsive, risk-taking behavior characteristic of teenagers. The frontal cortex simply lacks the structural integrity to restrain the emotionally charged limbic system. It is not until the mid-20s that we see full myelination and maturation. Myelination coats the neural pathways, vastly increasing the speed and efficiency of signal transmission. But here is the profound implication of this timeline. Because it matures last, the frontal cortex is the brain region least constrained by genes and most sculpted by experience. For over 2 decades, the environment dictates how the moral center of your brain is physically wired. If an individual spends their adolescence navigating a highly volatile, traumatic environment, their frontal cortex will prune itself to survive that specific trauma, often sacrificing long-term impulse control in favor of hypervigilance. They do not choose to have a weakened braking system. It is architected for them by their circumstances. When we judge a 25-year-old for moral failure, we are actually judging the culmination of 25 years of environmental sculpting over which they had absolutely no conscious control. They are the physical product of a slow baking process dictated by luck. If we reach back decades, we enter the realm of epigenetic scars. Early life experiences are not just psychological memories fading in the background. They leave permanent biological scars by physically altering receptor densities in the brain. We can visualize this through Waddington's epigenetic landscape, shown on the screen. Imagine a ball rolling down a topography of hills and valleys. The path it takes represents cellular development. In normal development, the ball rolls down a stable central valley, but environmental forces can warp this landscape. Look at the intense inputs of maternal stress and glucocorticoids raining down on the system. When an individual suffers adverse childhood experiences, commonly known as ACEs, it triggers a physical mechanism. These traumatic inputs permanently methylate DNA. Methylation does not change the genetic code itself, but it dictates how effectively those genes can be expressed. By methylating specific regions, ACEs physically dictate how your adult brain will respond to stress decades later. The ball is forced into a steep, rigid valley, creating a high anxiety phenotype. Imagine a child growing up in severe poverty or enduring chronic abuse. The constant flood of stress hormones epigenetically silences the genes responsible for producing calming glucocorticoid receptors in the brain. 30 years later, when that adult faces a minor inconvenience, their brain lacks the physical hardware to shut off the stress response. They panic or they lash out violently. We view their reaction as a failure of willpower or a flaw in their character. But the mechanics show us that their reaction was pre-programmed decades earlier by epigenetic methylation. Their adult capacity for emotional regulation was permanently crippled by environments they endured when they were powerless to escape them. They are not making a free choice. They are playing out a biological script written by early trauma. The landscape of their behavior was terraformed without their consent, proving that history dictates the present. We must now stretch our timeline across centuries to understand the cultural evolutionary loop. You were engineered by the ecological pressures of your ancestors thousands of years before you were born. Human culture is not a separate, ethereal realm floating above biology. It is a direct driver of genetic selection. Look at the global distribution map illustrating this mechanism. In regions like East Asia, rice agriculture required massive cooperative irrigation systems and communal labor. This severe ecological pressure selected for collectivism and genetic stability. Over generations, the populations that thrived were those whose neurobiology naturally leaned toward in-group harmony and conflict avoidance. Conversely, consider populations with extensive migratory histories. The physical demands of exploring unknown territories, surviving new climates, and crossing oceans selected for exploratory, individualistic genetic traits. We can pinpoint this down to specific alleles. The map highlights the DRD47R allele, a dopamine receptor variant associated with novelty seeking and risk taking. Notice the color coding. Areas with low frequency are green, while areas with high frequency, correlating to those ancient migratory paths, are orange. If you possess a high frequency of this allele, your brain is fundamentally wired to crave new stimuli and tolerate high risk. Now, imagine a modern individual impulsively quitting their stable job to start a risky tech venture. We celebrate their entrepreneurial spirit and their bold free will, but their propensity to take that exact risk was heavily weighted by the migratory pressures faced by their ancestors centuries ago. The cultural environment shaped the genetic evolution, which in turn shaped the modern brain. You did not choose your alleles, nor did you choose the ancestral ecological struggles that selected for them. Your personality, your individualism or collectivism, your risk tolerance, they are the distant echoes of ancient agricultural and migratory adaptations. We are simply the modern carriers of ancient evolutionary solutions, blindly executing behaviors optimized for a world that existed millennia ago. At this point, defenders of free will attempt to erect structural roadblocks, hoping to find a loophole in determinism. The first roadblock is the argument from chaos theory. They point to the butterfly effect, which proves that dynamic systems have extreme sensitivity to initial conditions. The logic assumes that because a system is unpredictable, it must therefore be undetermined, allowing a space for free will to operate. But this is a fundamental misunderstanding of the physics. Dynamic systems are indeed highly sensitive, as shown in the chaotic attractor diagram on the screen. A microscopic change in the value of the equation drastically alters the final trajectory. However, this does not grant the system freedom. Unpredictable systems still adhere strictly to physical laws. They are entirely determined. Every single twist and turn of those blue and orange loops is mathematically dictated by the preceding state. There is no magical intervention. Think of a modern weather forecast. We cannot perfectly predict if it will rain in exactly 14 days, because we cannot measure every single molecule of air pressure across the globe. But our inability to predict the weather does not mean the weather possesses free will. The rain does not choose to fall. The chaotic nature of the atmosphere is entirely bound by the rigid laws of fluid dynamics and thermodynamics. Therefore, chaos theory fails as a counterargument to determinism. Unpredictable does not equal undetermined. The fact that human behavior is complex and currently beyond our capacity to perfectly predict does not mean there is a conscious agent freely steering the ship. It simply means the causal chain is too mathematically complex for our current models to map. Chaos is not freedom, it is just determinism, operating at an unfathomable level of complexity. The illusion of agency hides in the mass we cannot yet calculate, but the mass itself remains unbreakable. The second structural roadblock proposed by free will advocates is the concept of emergence. They argue that because complex conscious intelligence arises from simple biological parts, a new free-thinking entity is born. Look at the model of emergence without an architect. We start with a simple rule, an individual ant following a pheromone scent trail. There is no commander. The ant has no grand vision. But when you aggregate millions of individual ants following this identical simple rule, linked bodies form a complex structure. Complex emergence occurs, such as a spanning bridge that creates a collective solution. The bridge is brilliant, but none of the individual parts possess intent. This directly maps to human neurobiology. A single neuron has no more free will than a single ant understands architecture. A neuron only knows how to receive neurotransmitters, reach an action potential, and fire. When you combine 86 billion of these blindly firing neurons, the complex emergent property we call consciousness arises. But emergence does not rewrite the fundamental rules of the underlying parts. The system scales up, but it does not magically generate a new, non-physical force. Consciousness is emergent local interaction. It is not a ghost operating the machine. When you feel a profound sense of purpose or make what feels like a deliberate ethical choice, you are simply experiencing the macro level output of billions of micro level chemical reactions. There is no central architect in your brain directing the workforce. The feeling of being a unified, freely choosing self is just a psychological spanning bridge created by the mindless algorithmic firing of your neural circuitry. Emergence explains the incredible complexity of human thought, but it completely fails to provide a mechanism for free will. The whole may be greater than the sum of its parts, but it is still entirely determined by them. We cannot attribute moral responsibility to an emergent property any more than we can arrest an ant bridge for trespassing. The final structural roadblock is the desperate appeal to quantum mechanics. Free will defenders argue that because subatomic particles operate with inherent randomness, this quantum indeterminacy scales up to provide humans with free choice. This is scientifically bankrupt. Look at the signal-to-noise filter diagram. At the very bottom, we have quantum noise, the erratic, unpredictable behavior of subatomic particles. But biology operates on a massive macrocellular scale. By the time you reach the level of a synapse, let alone a whole neuron, synaptic averaging occurs. The erratic behavior of trillions of subatomic particles cancels itself out, stabilizing into a predictable deterministic signal. The biological function at the top of the diagram is completely insulated from the quantum noise at the bottom. The brain is a warm, wet, massive organ that immediately absorbs and averages out these microscopic fluctuations, ensuring that our neural pathways remain locked in classical physics. But let us entertain a surgical thought experiment. Let us pretend, against all neurobiological evidence, that a quantum fluctuation in a single atom could somehow trigger a neuron to fire, causing you to make a sudden, unexpected decision. Does this give you free will? Absolutely not. If your actions are dictated by the random decay of an isotope or the unpredictable spin of an electron, you are not acting with intent. You are acting on chaotic chance. As the slide bluntly states, you cannot be held morally responsible for the outcome of a subatomic dice roll. Randomness is the exact opposite of agency. If your decision to commit a crime was truly random, generated by a quantum hiccup in your cortex, it means you did not author the action. Therefore, quantum mechanics offers no refuge for free will. It either cancels out entirely at the biological level, or it introduces a blind randomness that actively destroys any coherent concept of moral responsibility. We remain firmly bound within a deterministic framework. We have now dismantled the roadblocks and traced the causal chain from its genesis to its conclusion. This brings us to the grand unified causal loop. Look at the concentric circles encompassing behavior. Every present action is the inescapable sum of all past history. There is no biological crevice for free will to slip through. Let us review the unyielding mechanism of this loop. At the outermost ring, occurring millennia ago, we are bound by genes, culture, and evolutionary selection. Moving inward to childhood, our brains are physically wired by neurodevelopment and scarred by epigenetics. Moving to hours ago, our behavioral thresholds are manipulated by hormones and sensory inputs. Finally, moving to just 1 second ago, our neurobiology executes the readiness potentials. All of these rings collapse into the center point, behavior happening right now. You cannot separate the center from the rings that surround it. Each layer seamlessly feeds into the next, ensuring that every thought, impulse, and decision is the strict mechanical output of a history we did not author. If an individual commits a violent act, society desperately wants to judge the center point in isolation. We demand to know what they were thinking in that exact second. But that 1 second is entirely manufactured by the hormones flowing earlier that day, which were regulated by the epigenetic changes formed during a traumatic childhood, which were predisposed by an ancestral genetic lineage. The loop is closed. To claim that an individual possesses free will is to claim that they somehow possessed the magical ability to step outside of this loop, reach back through time, and rewrite their own genetic code, alter their own fetal environment, and recalibrate their own daily endocrine system. It is a logical impossibility. We are the vessels through which this grand causal loop expresses itself. Acknowledging this unbroken chain is not a defeat, it is the ultimate scientific reality of the human condition. If we accept the grand unified causal loop, the entire foundation of our legal and moral systems collapses. If humans are biological machines shaped by forces beyond their control, the justice system must absolutely abandon moral punishment in favor of protective quarantine. Look at the visual contrast on the slide. On the left, the gavel representing retribution is struck down. Our current system operates on the delusion of basic desert, the idea that people freely choose to be malicious and therefore fundamentally deserve to suffer for their sins. This is intellectually bankrupt. On the right, we see a car enclosed in a protective bubble representing quarantine. Consider this surgical thought experiment. Imagine a modern car driving down the street. Suddenly, the brakes fail due to a manufacturing defect, and the car crashes into a pedestrian. Do you arrest the car? Do you put the car on trial, lecture it on its moral failings, and beat it with a sledgehammer to teach it a lesson? No, you do not punish a car for having broken brakes. However, you also do not let the car back on the road to run over someone else. You restrict its movement to protect society. You take it off the street and attempt to fix the mechanism. This is the exact model we must apply to human beings. When a person commits a horrific crime, their biological brakes have failed. Their frontal cortex did not possess the structural integrity to inhibit their amygdala. We must restrict their movement. We must lock them away to ensure the public is safe. But this justice must be a pragmatic quarantine, not a dispenser of moral retribution. We quarantine someone with a highly infectious disease without hating them. We must quarantine those with violent neurological outputs with the same pragmatic detachment. We must remove the hatred, the self-righteousness, and the desire for vengeance from our legal framework, treating criminality as a public health crisis rather than a spiritual failing. This pragmatic detachment brings us to the most profoundly human aspect of this science, the empathy equation. Realizing that you are nothing more than the product of biological and environmental luck should not induce despair. Rather, it is the ultimate source of forgiveness. Look at the simple equation on the screen. We have the criminal on one side and you on the other. Spanning across both is the overwhelming factor of luck. We are the sum of our luck. There is no fundamental biological difference in the capacity for choice between you and the worst among us. If you consider yourself a successful, law-abiding citizen, you must humbly recognize that you did not author your own success. You had the luck of a healthy fetal environment, the luck of proper nutrition, the luck of an education system that built your prefrontal cortex, and the lack of a neurochemical balance that allows you to easily regulate your impulses. The person sitting in a prison cell simply drew a different hand in the exact same lottery. They suffer the bad luck of genetic vulnerabilities, adverse childhood experiences, and crushing environmental stressors. When you deeply internalize this mechanism, hatred becomes illogical. You cannot hate someone for the shape of their brain any more than you can hate them for their height or their eye color. Empathy ceases to be a religious platitude and becomes a strict scientific mandate. The empathy equation forces us to look at the most damaged, dangerous members of our society and recognize that, but for a few microscopic shifts in DNA methylation or prenatal hormone exposure, we would be sitting in their exact position. When we dismantle the myth of the self made individual, we replace arrogance with profound compassion for those whose biological machinery was engineered for failure. This rigorous understanding eliminates the ego of the successful and the stigma of the broken, binding us all together in the shared reality of our deterministic existence. Rejecting free will is not a descent into nihilism. It is an invitation to build a society based on radical empathy, tolerance, and rigorous scientific truth. Let us review the three pillars of this new paradigm. First, the mechanism. We must fully accept that behavior is an unbroken chain of prior physical causes. Every action is the mechanical result of neurobiology, hormones, epigenetics, and evolutionary history. Second, the myth. We must discard the illusions that comfort us. Chaos theory, emergent complexity, and quantum consciousness do not grant intent. They are simply complex, deterministic systems or irrelevant microscopic noise masquerading as agency. Third, the mission. This is where the theory collides with our future. As we enter the AI era, we are building highly complex algorithmic machines that mimic human intelligence. We already know that these artificial networks operate on strict, determined rules, no matter how unpredictable their outputs become. We must apply that exact same objective logic to our own organic circuitry. We are biological algorithms. The mission, therefore, is to replace blame with understanding and to replace retribution with quarantine. If we can look at an autonomous vehicle that crashes and pragmatically fix its code without hating it, we must learn to look at a human being who fails and pragmatically fix their environment without hating them. Recognizing our mechanical nature does not strip us of our humanity. It finally allows us to treat each other with genuine grace, free from the cruelty of moral judgment. We are machines, yes, but we are machines capable of understanding our own programming and protecting one another from the malfunctions of our shared biology. That concludes our exploration for today. Thank you for your time, and see you next time.